The ham had been on the table for exactly 4 minutes when my mother made her announcement. I remember the detail with crystalline precision because I had been watching the steam rise off the glazed surface, curling into the cool air of the dining room, and for a fleeting moment, I was transported back 30 years. I was thinking about how I used to love Easter as a child, how this room used to feel before the walls closed in and the air grew thick with unspoken debts and silent scorekeeping. I remembered the egg hunts in the backyard of this very house, the plastic shells hidden behind the rhododendron bushes, my sneakers soaking wet from the morning dew, the grass staining my socks. I remembered Grandma Ruth pressing a crinkled $5 bill into my palm, her skin like parchment paper, her eyes bright with a conspiratorial glint as she whispered that I was her favorite, but I shouldn't tell anyone. The way this dining room used to smell like safety, like honey glaze and good coffee, in a world that hadn't yet decided what to ask of me, a world where I wasn't yet a resource to be allocated. But that safety had evaporated a long time ago. The warmth had been replaced by the heat of performance, the heavy, suffocating weight of a family dynamic that relied on one person giving and giving until there was nothing left. There were 32 people packed into my parents' dining room that afternoon. It was a sea of faces, some beloved, some barely recognizable. Aunts, uncles, cousins I saw twice a year at obligatory gatherings where we all pretended we were closer than we actually were. My parents' neighbors from down the street, the Millers, who had somehow become permanent fixtures at every family gathering over the past decade, likely because my mother needed an audience for her curated life. The table was a battlefield dressed in fine china and linen napkins, and I was walking into it blind, or at least, that was what they wanted me to think. My sister Vivien sat directly across from me, the centerpiece of the table framing her like a halo. She was wearing a new dress, a pale blue wrap dress that probably cost more than my weekly grocery budget, her hair professionally blown out, bouncing with a sheen that spoke of expensive salon appointments and leisure time. Her boyfriend Marcus sat beside her, looking distinctly uncomfortable in a dress shirt with a collar that was half a size too tight, his fingers constantly tugging at the fabric as if he could loosen it by sheer will. He looked like a man who knew he was in a room where he didn't belong, a prop in a play he hadn't auditioned for. Vivien had been unusually quiet since I arrived, a deviation from her usual role as the chatterbox, the center of attention, the one whose voice dominated the room with stories of her latest projects or her boyfriend's minor accomplishments. Her silence was heavy, charged with a static electricity that made the hair on my arms stand up. I had noted it, cataloged it, and then dismissed it as tiredness or perhaps a hangover. That was my first mistake. Vivien is never quiet without a reason. Vivien is silent only when she is holding a card she isn't ready to play, or when she is waiting for someone else to play a card on her behalf. My name is Nora. I am 33 years old. I'm a senior compliance officer for a mid-sized financial services firm in Chicago's West Loop. My life is a series of spreadsheets, regulations, and risk assessments. I spend my days ensuring that numbers add up, that rules are followed, that the chaotic impulses of human greed are checked by the rigid structures of the law. I have worked genuinely, relentlessly, and without assistance for every single thing I own. My apartment, a modest one-bedroom in a walk-up building that I painted myself. My car, a reliable sedan with high mileage that I bought used and maintain with obsessive care. My savings account, a carefully guarded fortress built by skipping lunches and wearing the same winter coat for 6 years. The week-long trip to Portugal I took 2 years ago, a solitary journey of catharsis that my mother had described to relatives with a dismissive wave of her hand as one of Nora's little adventures. I say this not to inventory my life for applause, not to seek validation from strangers, but because context matters here. Because what happened at that Easter table only makes complete sense if you understand how thoroughly, and for how long, my family had constructed a different story about me. They had written a narrative in which I was the sturdy one, the rock, the one who didn't need help because I was doing so well. It was a convenient story for them. It allowed them to direct their resources, their sympathy, and their financial bailouts toward the struggling sibling while expecting me to smile and nod and pay for my own portion of the collective burden. My mother stood up, her wine glass in hand, the picture of matriarchal grace. She smiled at the room, a specific kind of smile I have known my entire life. It was warm on the surface, a beacon of hospitality, but load-bearing underneath, a structural support for a manipulation that was about to be deployed. It was the smile she used when she had already decided something, when the verdict had been rendered in a private court of her own mind, and she was simply performing the announcement portion for the benefit of the public record. She tapped her fork against her glass, the clear ringing sound cutting through the murmur of conversation, silencing the room. "Before we eat," she said, her voice projecting with practiced ease, "your father and I want to share some wonderful news about Vivien." I set down my fork. The clatter of the silverware against the plate was louder than I intended, a small punctuation mark in the silence. A pause settled over the table. My father, seated at the head, nodded slowly, his hands clasped in front of him, the overseer of the family trust, or so he liked to believe. "As most of you know," my mother continued, her eyes sweeping the room, landing on everyone but me, "Grandma Ruth's estate has been in the final stages of distribution. The trust she established years ago included a portion specifically designated for Nora." She paused for exactly the right amount of time, a theatrical beat designed to build tension. "After a great deal of family discussion, thoughtful, careful discussion, we've decided together that Nora's portion will be redirected to Vivien." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. The air pressure dropped. "Vivien is at a genuinely pivotal point in her life right now," my mother pressed on, her voice smoothing over the cracks in the room's atmosphere, "and needs the support in a way that Nora simply doesn't. Nora has her career, her stability. She already has enough, and she understands." The last 3 words were a command disguised as a statement. She understands. She agrees. She submits. 32 heads turned toward me in unison, a synchronized swim of curiosity and shock. I want to describe what that moment felt like from the inside, but I'm not sure language is fully equipped for it. It wasn't anger, not immediately. Anger is hot and loud. This was cold and silent. It was something more structural than anger, something architectural. It felt like a door swinging open onto a room you had suspected existed for years. A dark, dusty room in the back of the house where they kept the ugly truths, but you had never been permitted to see it clearly. Every time my accomplishments were mentioned briefly at dinner before the conversation pivoted back to Vivien's latest crisis, every holiday where I quietly covered costs that were never acknowledged, every time I heard the refrain, "Nora is fine, Nora can handle it, Nora has enough," all of it suddenly had architecture. It had a blueprint. It had a purpose. All of it had been leading here, to this table, to this announcement delivered in front of 32 witnesses, so that the social pressure of the room could do the work that guilt and obligation hadn't quite finished. They had built a trap. They had dressed it in a holiday, put ham on the table next to it, and invited an audience to watch me walk into it. I looked at my mother. I looked at my father. I looked at Vivien, who was staring resolutely at her plate, tracing the pattern of the china with her finger. "I don't understand," I said, keeping my voice completely level. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I used the tone I use in deposition rooms. "Because a conversation like that never happened. Not with me." My mother's smile tightened by a degree, a hairline fracture in the facade. "Nora, this really isn't the time," she said, her voice dropping to a warning whisper. "You just made it the time," I replied, gesturing to the room. "In front of 32 people, you made it the time." Vivien looked at her plate. Marcus reached for his water glass and didn't let go of it, his knuckles white. "You have a good job," my father said from the head of the table. He used the particular tone he reserves for matters he has decided are resolved, the tone of a judge dismissing a case. "You have your apartment, your salary, your whole setup down there in the city. Your sister is trying to build something real. It's not a large ask. Nora, it's family." "It's my trust fund, Dad," I said. "Grandma left it to me. She put my name on the document." "Grandma would have wanted the family taken care of, all of us," he countered, his voice rising slightly. "Grandma wanted me taken care of," I said. "That's the reason she established a designated portion. She wasn't confused. She wasn't making a mistake she'd want corrected later by you." "You're being dramatic," my mother snapped. "I'm being accurate," I corrected. "There's a difference." My mother's palm came down on the table hard enough to rattle the wine glasses and send a small ripple across the surface of the gravy boat. The room flinched collectively. Even Vivien looked up. "That is enough." My mother's voice had dropped into its lowest register. the one that meant we were past performance and into something raw. "We are not doing this today. You are being selfish. You are embarrassing this family in front of people who love us. And frankly, after everything your father and I have sacrificed for you over the years." "What have you sacrificed for me, Mom?" The question landed and sat there, a heavy, uninvited guest in the middle of the feast. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen. She opened her mouth. Something moved across her face, a shadow. Not guilt exactly, more like a calculation running behind her eyes, a frantic reassessment of the ledger she kept in her head. She closed her mouth again. "I'm asking genuinely," I said, my voice steady. "I'd like you to list it, because I have been keeping my own list for about 3 years now, and my list looks very different from whatever accounting you're running in your head. Mine has dollar amounts on it. It has dates. It has canceled checks for your mortgage payments. It has receipts for Vivien's car repairs." My Aunt Patricia, seated 2 chairs from my mother, placed a careful hand on her arm, a physical attempt to plug the leaking dam. A cousin across the room leaned to his wife and whispered something behind his hand. The room had taken on the specific discomfort of people witnessing something they had been invited to observe, but hadn't fully agreed to. They had come for Easter dinner, for ham and small talk. They were getting something considerably more honest. My father said my name in a warning tone, a low growl meant to intimidate. "Nora!" I didn't look at him. I turned toward the corner of the room. She had been there since before most guests arrived. I had let her in myself, 43 minutes before dinner was called, introducing her to the 2 relatives who asked only as a colleague who needed somewhere quiet to make some calls. She was a ghost in the room, unobtrusive, blending into the wallpaper. She had a glass of water she hadn't touched, a plate of appetizers she had politely accepted and left mostly uneaten, and a black leather briefcase that had sat closed on the floor beside her chair for the entire meal. She had watched everything with the patient, unreadable expression of someone who has spent a career in rooms where people are arguing about money, watching greed and entitlement clash with law and logic. Her name was Diane Aquifer. She was 51 years old, a managing trustee and estate attorney with 23 years of experience. And she had overseen Grandma Ruth's trust since its establishment in 2019. I had called her 8 days earlier on a Tuesday evening. The catalyst had been a birthday dinner for our cousin the previous weekend. Vivien had been there, 3 glasses of Chardonnay deep, loose, and careless. She had let something slip, a casual comment about things getting sorted out at Easter. She hadn't said what exactly, but the tone, the glance she shared with our mother, the subtle nod, it had told me with reasonable certainty where this holiday was heading. I knew the signs. I knew the playbook. I had spent the following 2 days deciding whether I was overreacting, whether I was becoming paranoid, whether my family was capable of something this brazen. I had spent day 3 accepting that I wasn't, that they were. I had called Diane on day 4. I remembered the phone call, sitting in my office, the city lights of the West Loop twinkling outside my window. I had expected to leave a message, but she had picked up on the second ring. I explained the situation, my voice tight with suppressed fury. She listened without interrupting. Then she said 5 words that changed everything. "We can protect your interest." I nodded once in her direction. It was a signal we had agreed upon. A green light. Diane set down her water glass with no particular urgency. She reached down, picked up her briefcase, set it on her lap, and stood. She smoothed her jacket. She was not a physically imposing woman, medium height, reading glasses pushed up on her head, sensible heels, but she carried herself with the particular stillness of someone who has never once needed volume to command a room. She moved toward the head of the table, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. "Good afternoon, everyone," she began. Her voice was pleasant and unhurried, a stark contrast to the emotional turbulence my mother had just unleashed. "I apologize for the interruption to your meal. My name is Diane Aquifer. I am the managing trustee of the Ruth Eleanor Hartwell estate." A collective intake of breath. My mother's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something harder in the space of about 4 seconds. Her face went pale. "Nora, who is this woman?" she demanded, though her voice wavered, betraying the fact that she already knew. "She's the trustee, Mom," I said, my voice clear. "She's the one whose signature any fund transfer would actually require." Diane opened her briefcase, the zipper sound loud in the quiet room. She removed a tabbed folder and laid it open on the corner of the table closest to my father, placing it directly in his line of sight without making eye contact with him. The gesture was practiced and entirely deliberate. She wanted him to see the documents. She wanted him to understand, before she said a word, what category of conversation this had become. The Hartwell Trust was established in July of 2019 and amended to its final form in March of 2022, approximately 3 months before Mrs. Hartwell's passing, Diane stated. She spoke with the rhythmic precision of a closing argument. She was of sound mind at both signings, and we have full documentation supporting that fact, including neurologist reports and independent witness testimonies. She turned a page in the folder. The designated beneficiary for the primary distribution, totaling $94,000, currently held in a managed account at current value, is Nora Christine Hartwell Breaks. She looked up, scanning the room. The designation is explicit, specific, and legally documented. It is not subject to informal family reallocation. It is not subject to family discussion or thoughtful consideration by parties other than the grantor. She looked at my father directly for the first time. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Any amendment to the designated beneficiary, she continued, her voice hardening slightly, would require a formal written request from the current beneficiary, a 30-day review period by my office, independent legal counsel for the beneficiary to confirm no undue influence, and a court filing if any party chose to contest the process. That process, at minimum, takes 4 months. And based on the current status of the beneficiary, who is an adult of sound mind, it would almost certainly be denied. My father's mouth was open. Nothing was coming out of it. The silence was absolute. I also want to address something my office became aware of during a routine correspondence review last week, Diane said. Her tone didn't change. It remained pleasant, professional, almost conversational, which somehow made it worse. My office received 5 written communications over the past 4 months requesting information about the feasibility of redirecting the beneficiary designation without the named beneficiary's direct involvement. She paused, letting that sink in. Those communications were submitted as a joint request. She still didn't look at my parents by name. She didn't need to. Every person in the room knew exactly who she meant. My office responded to each communication clearly and in writing, explaining that no such change could be initiated without Nora's full participation and documented consent. It appears those responses were not shared with Nora. The refrigerator in the kitchen was audible, a low, mechanical hum. A child at the far end of the table, my cousin's youngest, maybe 7 years old, asked his mother quietly if dessert was soon. His mother shushed him with a hand on his shoulder and did not take her eyes off Diane. My mother sat down. She didn't announce that she was sitting. She didn't say anything at all. She simply lowered herself back into her chair and became smaller in the way that people become smaller when the story they've been telling publicly runs out of room to stand in. She looked like a balloon that had been popped. My father closed his mouth, opened it again, struggling to form words. "We were simply exploring options," he stammered, his voice weak. "I understand," Diane said in a tone that indicated she understood completely and found it thoroughly documented. She stared him down, her gaze unyielding. "Are there any questions about the trust's current legal standing or the distribution timeline?" Nobody spoke. 32 people found places to look that were not my parents' faces. The shame in the room was palpable, a thick fog. "Wonderful," Diane said, breaking the spell. She closed the folder, returned it to her briefcase, and clasped it shut with 2 clean clicks that were somehow the most satisfying sounds I had ever heard in that dining room. She picked up her water glass, took a sip, and sat back down. She had delivered a surgical strike, removing the tumor of my parents' entitlement without raising her voice, without breaking a sweat. It was a master class in professional domination. I looked at my father. I looked at my mother. They wouldn't meet my eyes. They were staring at the table, at the ham, at the gravy boat, anywhere but at me or the woman who had just dismantled their scheme. I stayed for 25 more minutes. Leaving immediately would have felt like its own kind of performance, a dramatic exit that would have allowed them to paint me as the villain, the dramatic daughter who causes a scene and storms out. I was finished performing for this family, but I was also determined not to give them the satisfaction of my absence. I ate some of the ham. It was cold now, but I didn't care. I chewed slowly, deliberately. I answered my Aunt Patricia's careful, gentle questions about my neighborhood in the West Loop, about my job, about my life that existed entirely outside of this toxic orbit. I listened to my father make 2 attempts at normal conversation with relatives who responded politely and briefly, their eyes darting nervously between him and me, before they found reasons to refill their drinks or check on their kids. The atmosphere was heavy, the festive mood obliterated. The neighbors, the Millers, looked like they wished they had stayed home. Vivien did not speak for the remainder of the meal. She pushed food around her plate. A ghost in her own victory party that had turned into a wake. When I stood to leave, the scraping of my chair against the floor sounded like a gunshot. I announced I had a long drive back to the city. My mother didn't offer to walk me out. My father didn't stand. But as I reached the front hall, I heard footsteps behind me. Vivien followed me to the front porch without being asked. The screen door slapped shut behind us. The afternoon had gone gray, the kind of flat Midwestern Easter sky that can't decide whether it wants to be spring yet. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and dying tulips. She looked tired in a way the new dress couldn't cover. I noticed it now in the outdoor light, away from the staging of the dining room. There were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there at Christmas. There was something tightly wounded in the way she was holding her own arms, hugging herself against a chill that was internal. "I didn't know she was going to do it like that," Vivien said, her voice barely a whisper. "In front of everyone." "But you knew she was going to do it," I said. It wasn't a question. She looked at the porch railing, tracing a peeling paint chip with her thumb. The silence was its own confirmation. She had known. She had accepted the premise. She had been willing to take what was mine because she felt she needed it more, because she had been told she was entitled to it. "I don't know what's happening in your life right now," I said, pulling on my coat. I wasn't angry at her, not in the same way. She was a symptom, not the disease. "I don't know what you told them you needed, or what they promised you, or what conversation happened in this house that I wasn't part of, but I need you to understand something clearly." I waited until she looked at me. I wanted her to see my eyes, to see the resolve there. "Grandma left that money to me because she paid attention. She watched this family for 81 years. She understood exactly how it worked. She understood the dynamics, the favoritism, the subtle theft of energy and resources. And she decided that I needed something that was legally, documentably, unambiguously mine. That wasn't an accident. That wasn't her being careless or forgetful or unfair to you. That was her being precise." Vivien's eyes were bright in a way that might have been tears held carefully in place. She looked stricken. "I'm not your enemy," I said, softening my tone slightly. "I've never been your enemy, but I am also not a resource that this family gets to allocate. I am a person she loved specifically, and she made sure I'd have something that proved it." I walked down the porch steps, leaving her there in the gray light. I got into my car and started the engine. I drove home on the expressway with the windows cracked despite the cold because I needed the air moving. I needed to feel the wind on my face, to know I was moving forward, away from that house, away from that dynamic. I called Diane from the highway to thank her. "It was my pleasure, Nora," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. "The distribution timeline is 8 to 10 weeks. Clean. No anticipated complications. Just sign the papers I send over." I thanked her again and meant it in a way that felt bigger than the words. She had done more than protect my money. She had protected my reality. She had stood as a witness to the truth. I thought about Grandma Ruth for most of the drive, the $5 bills, the whispered favorites, the way she had pulled me aside at my college graduation, away from the noise and the photographs where everyone pretended to be happy. She had held both my hands, her grip surprisingly strong for a woman of 80. She had looked directly into my eyes, her gaze piercing through the cataracts. "I see you working, sweetheart," she had said. "I see all of it. The late nights, the worry, the holding it together when everyone else is falling apart. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise, and don't let anyone take what you've earned." She had seen it. She had written it down, signed it in front of witnesses, and filed it with an attorney. She had built a fortress around my future because she knew the people in my present would try to storm it. The trust would clear in 8 to 10 weeks. I already had a list. I had a solo trip to the Azores I had been rescheduling for 4 years, always finding a reason to delay, always putting my own joy last. I had a conversation with a real estate attorney about a 1-bedroom in the neighborhood I had been watching since last spring, a place with a balcony where I could drink my coffee in peace. I had a savings threshold I'd been protecting so carefully. It had started to feel like holding my breath. I could breathe out now. The tightness in my chest that I hadn't even realized was there began to loosen. Grandma Ruth had handed me a door, and she had made sure no one else could hold it shut. I was 33 years old, and I was finally, completely ready to walk through. Reflecting on it now, months later, I realized that the money was never really the point. It was the principle. It was the visibility. For so long, I had been invisible to my parents, or rather, I had been a utility, a function that takes inputs and produces outputs. I was the one who was fine, the one who didn't need help. And because I was fine, I was fair game. My stability was a tax they felt entitled to levy. They looked at my independence and saw a surplus they could redistribute. They didn't see the cost of that independence. They didn't see the anxiety, the exhaustion, the lonely climb. They just saw the result and decided I could spare it for the sibling they had chosen to invest in. They gambled on my silence. They banked on my passivity. They assumed that the role I had played for 33 years, the good daughter, the reliable one, the one who swallows her pride for the sake of peace, was a permanent condition. They underestimated me. They confused kindness with weakness. They confused stability with obligation. And in doing so, they lost the one thing they thought they had unlimited access to: me. Justice isn't always a dramatic explosion. Sometimes it's a quiet professional standing in a corner. Sometimes it's a folder placed on a table. Sometimes it's the sound of a briefcase clicking shut. Sometimes it's simply refusing to play the part written for you. That day, I didn't just protect an inheritance. I reclaimed my narrative. I forced my family to see me, not as a resource, but as a person with boundaries and legal rights. And in the silence that followed, as 32 people watched the truth dismantle the lie, I found the most satisfying revenge of all. I didn't have to say another word. The truth spoke for me. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt the sting of being the responsible one, who is expected to carry the weight while others reap the benefits, or if you simply enjoy seeing accountability served with a side of legal precision, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps this story reach others who might need to hear it. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dive narratives where we unpack the complexities of family, money, and the pursuit of justice. And most importantly, tell me in the comments, have you ever had to set a hard boundary with your family? Have you ever had to bring in outside help to protect what was yours? I read every single comment, and your stories are what make this community so powerful. Thank you for listening. Stay strong, stay sharp, and remember, your stability is a gift you give yourself, not a debt you owe to others.